Perceptions and culture. What is web-based social cognition? This means that it targets how individuals perceive each other on a web-based platform. Web-based social cognition is referring to there being some consistency between first impressions formed and on an online basis in response to observations made in the real world. Essentially, if you're meeting someone through Instagram or Facebook and you're having that interaction only online, it is going to have a different impact to how you perceive them versus if you see them in person and you're able to see the nonverbal cues. Next, I'm going to talk about how do our perceptions change based on cultural difference. First of all, we see the world through our cultural lenses. For example, I am a Latin American female who sees the world through a different cultural lens as someone who is from a European cultural background. For an example, two cultures can look at the same scenario and perceive it differently. For example, I being from a Latin American culture, it is very common for us to greet each other with a kiss on the cheek and to hug, and we are very social, over the top individuals. And that is part of my cultural lens, and it's part of my cultural background. For a European cultural, it is going to be different because if I try to approach a European individual who has that background and their culture is different than mine, they're going to perceive me stepping in and giving them a kiss on the cheek as something could be even offensive because it's not part of their cultural lens. They're seeing it differently because that's not how they were brought up. And mainly the most important thing is that it's not about what we see, but what we perceive. So that's really the most essential part of how our perceptions change based on our cultural difference. Now, I want to compare two different cultures. For example, we're going to take a look at right now of the Arabic culture. A few different bullet points and things that I've learned about this culture through this research is that the Arabic culture has changed and it has modernized because they still hold the values I'm about to speak on very, very closely to them. The family unit is very important to them, and their children live with them until they're married. It is not uncommon that even after they are married, the family will still provide for their children. And the male offspring is favored due to them being the ones who carry on the family name. Another formality that carries on great importance in our culture is how women dress and how they live within their home. For example, women typically have a private area in their household separate from men, especially in rural areas. The most devoted women cover their faces as well as their bodies in veils and robes. So these are some Arabic cultural items that I have found through my research, and I'm going to go ahead and compare these findings with the American culture. Now, to do so, I found a graph that was used by Hofstede. He is a researcher, and he researched the culture of the American culture and the Arabic culture. And he used 4 different ways to measure the different kinds of culture. So for the first one that we're going to see, it's PDI, and that stands for empire distance. This basically means that it is the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a country accept and expect the power that is distributed unequally. Essentially, that in the Arabic culture, we can see, which is the darker shade, we can see that they more widely accept the fact that they have the power that is distributed is unequal. It's not an equal power, and they are very full aware of that, versus Americans don't experience that. The next one is IDV, which is in essentially individualism versus collectivism. And that means that in this one, the USA is much more individual. They have more individual characteristics, which means that their societies are more independent and everyone is expected to look after themselves, while in collectivism, societies essentially are more woven together, and they are, they experience extreme loyalty, and they are put in cohesive groups essentially for the rest of their lives. Americans have more of the individualism aspect versus collectivism. And the next one I'm going to go through is masculinity versus femininity, and this is the MAS. Now, as you can see, this was actually very surprising to me because I figured that the Arabic culture would be a bit more higher than the American, but it looks like the American actually is a little bit higher in terms of masculinity, which means that the society that the American culture has is definitely the men have more of a tough, assertive role, while in the femininity, the emotional gender roles overlap, and both men and women are supposed to be modest and tender. So the USA, it's showing that we have more of the masculinity, which men are supposed to be more assertive, and they're supposed to have essentially more of that assertive role. And that was surprising to me because I would have thought that the Arabic culture had more of that than the USA. But that was very interesting to find out. And then the last measure that was used in the Hofstede Cultural Dimensions graph is the UAI, and this stands for an uncertainty avoidance. This essentially means that we can see here that the Arab world's members feel more threatened by ambiguous or unknown situations than Americans. So they're kind of living in a more they feel more threatened by unknown situations than Americans. Americans are able to work more cohesively, and they can deal with unknown situations better than the Arab culture. And to end all of it, I'm going to essentially speak about what I learned and things that were really surprising to me, because as going through this research, we figure out what we know about the different cultures. And for the Arabic culture, I was very surprised how family-oriented they are. I think we all have a preconceived notion of what the Arabic culture is, and I was very surprised because I am Latin American, and I definitely have this same value in my culture, which is how family-oriented they are and how much they value loyalty. That is very similar to my own cultural background, and how women have separate living areas in their own homes. This is surprising. I just didn't know that it extended not only from the outside world, but to their in-home living, and how they had to be separate, and they had their own space. And that is not very similar to the American culture because everything is very mixed in together. And the third thing that I found very surprising was how similar the Arabic and the American culture is regarding the masculinity result of the Hofstede Cultural Dimension graph. That was very interesting to me, how the American culture is, pretty much the same, and it showed even a little bit more than the Arabic in terms of how men are portrayed in the American culture. And I would have thought the Arabic culture would have been way more than American, but it was interesting to see that it actually showed that they were similar and the Americans were more. So all in all, in this presentation, I learned a lot about the different cultures, and I think that what I can take away the most is that we perceive cultures through our own cultural lens and what we experience and what we were taught and how we were brought up. And I think it's important to just take a look and know how we're all different and how God made us all so different and unique. And learning about different cultures is definitely something that I look forward to in the future.